Now we are going to look at subtraction of fractions, which we will to refer to as differences. Now, the first example that we are going to look at is the difference between 1 and a unit fraction. So we will do these 6 questions here mentally. So the difference between a quarter and 1. So you should know that is 3/4. The difference between a half and 1 is a half. The difference between 1/10 and 1 is 9/10. And the difference between a third and 1 is 2/3. And the difference between 1/8 and 1 is 7/8. And the difference between a sixth and 1 is 5/6. Now, if you struggle with this, I recommend using a number line. So for example, for the second one, here you would locate your two numbers, which are, you would have 1, let's say here, and then let's say 0.5 would be in between here. So what's the difference between 1 and 1/2? So what's the distance, the difference between these two numbers? Well, I can clearly see that the distance here is a half. Okay, so let's move on to the next example. So we're going to look at unit 1 as an integer, the difference between that and a fraction, which is not a unit fraction. So here we have the difference between 1 and 1, which is 0. Here we have the difference between 3/4 and 1, which is a quarter. Here we have the difference between this is also a quarter. This is a quarter, so the difference between a quarter, or you can say 2/8, and 1 is 6/8. The difference here between 3/5 and 1 is 2/5. The difference between 4/10 and 1 is 6/10. The difference between 5/6 and 1 is a sixth. And the difference between 2/3 and 1 is a third. Again, if you struggle with these, I recommend using a number line. So let's say we look at the last one. You locate both numbers on a number line. So let's say you have 0 here, 1 here, and then I have to break this up into thirds. So let's say I have a third here, 2/3 here. So this is 2/3. And then what's the difference between 2/3 and 1? We can clearly see that the difference is a third. Okay. Now moving on to example 3. So here we're going to look at the difference between fractions that have a common denominator. Well, the same number as the denominator, I should say. So here you're looking at the difference between 1/4 and 3/4. So that's 2/4. 2/4. And again, if you struggle solving these mentally, recommend using a number line. Here you have the difference between 2 and 7/8. So that would be 5/8. Here we're looking at the difference between 1 and 2 halves. So it's a half. The difference between 3 and 8/10 is 5/10. The difference between 1 and 4/5 is 3/5. The difference between 1/3 and 2/3 is a third. And the difference between 4/6 and 5/6 is a sixth. Moving on, let's take a look at here. We have example 4, a little more complicated. We have mixed fractions and a fraction with same denominator. So here we have 1.5, and here we have a half. So the difference between a half and 1.5 would be 1. Here the difference between 3/4 and 1 1/4 would be 2/4, or a half. Here the difference between 6/10 and 1 5/10 would be 9/10. Difference here between 4/8 and 1 2/8 would be 6/8. And here the difference between 2/3 and 1 1/3 would be 2/3. And here the difference between 4/5 and 1 2/5 would be 3/5. Again, if you have any difficulties with these questions, I recommend using a number line. Let's do it for, let's say, the second one here. So you would locate both numbers on a number line. So let's do that. So here let's use 0, 1, and let's put 2 here. And then I'm dealing with quarters here, so I have to quarter that into 4 pieces, my number line. And where are my two numbers? So I have 1 1/4 would be here. So 1 1/4, and 3/4 would be here. So what's the difference between these two numbers? We can clearly see that it's 2/4. Okay? Moving on. Now we're going to look at the difference between similar fractions, kind of like what we did in addition. So here you have to use equivalent fractions to resolve this. So here this is 2/4. The difference between 1/4 and 2/4 is 1/4. Difference between 2/4 and 3/4 is 1/4. The difference between 1/8 and 2/8 is 1/8. The difference between 4/8 and 6/8 is 2/8. The difference between 2/10 and 9/10 is 7/10. The difference between 1 and 8/10 is 7/10. And the difference between 1 and 4 is 3/6. 1 and 4/6. Again, if you struggle with any of these, I recommend using a number line. So same thing here, we're going to look at mixed fractions. Same idea. Here you have 1 1/2. The difference between 1/2 and 1 1/4, that would be 3/4. Here the difference between 1 1/2 and 1 1/8 would be negative 3/8. Tough one. Here the difference between 1/5, 2/10, and 1 1/10 would be 9/10. The difference between 2/10 and 1 4/10 would be 1 2/10. The difference between a 6 and 1 4/6 would be 1 1/2 or 1 3/6. And the difference between 1/3 and 2 5/6 would be 2 3/6, or 2 1/2. Again, if you have any troubles with this one here, use the number line. So let's use an example for the number line. For the first one, let's take a look at the difference. So if I have quarters and halves, I'll have to locate both numbers on my number line. So let's do that. Just use 0 as a reference point. Say 1's here, 2's over here, and then I have to quarter that. So let's half, quarters. So where are my two numbers? Well, I have one number here at 1/2, and the other number is at 1 1/4. Now I can see how many quarters are there as a difference between 1/2. There's 1, 2, and 3. 3/4. Okay, so just use that number line if you're ever stuck. That's it for difference.